Hey everybody, Jamin here from Game Show. So you probably already heard the really sad news that Satoru Iwata, the late president of CEO of Nintendo, he passed away last week, according to an announcement from the company. Obviously, this was received by a lot of people with understandably really sad news, even though he's someone that you probably didn't get to shake hands with. Millions of us, billions of us, were touched by work that he and Nintendo did. So it's a huge, it's obviously a huge loss for the world of games, because you realize when you start to, dig around a little bit, is how different Iwata was from other CEOs at other game companies. Unlike someone like Bobby Kotick at Activision, or Kazuo Hirai of Sony, or Satya Nadella of Microsoft, and so on, Iwata was a real leader with a personality, and he was really connected with the players themselves. He was often quoted as saying that he felt like this real kinship, that deep down everybody was really a gamer. So it's also important to note that he wasn't like an outsider who was brought into a company like Nintendo just to steer the ship, but he was someone like a lot of people at Nintendo who worked their way through the ranks. There was this first generation of people like Miyamoto, for example, or Koji Kondo, the sound designer for lots of famous Mario games, for example. They all came in about the same time, and so Iwata was really involved in the development of the Kirby games, Balloon Fight, and Earthbound, all of which are really beloved titles. And there's also these amazing anecdotes, when the development of Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Smash Brothers Melee was facing problems, he'd step away from his presidential role and then swoop in to optimize the code. So he was a real hands-on kind of guy who really understood the game design process, and that's really unusual. There aren't a lot of people who had game companies, especially ones of that size, who really have a deep understanding of games and game design. So he wasn't your ordinary president by any stretch of the imagination. If you look outside of the world of games, or the effect that Nintendo has on things outside the world of games, one of the big questions that still remains is what's going to happen to Nintendo, now that he's gone. It's interesting. So right now, what we know is that Shigeru Miyamoto of Mario fame, and Genyo Takeda will take over in the interim. And Takeda, if you haven't heard of him before, he did really important engineering behind the scenes, like developing the save batteries and the NES carts and the architecture of the Wii. So the Wall Street Journal has speculated that Miyamoto is likely to stay on permanently as CEO. But the thing is that Miyamoto has been a game creator for his entire career, and the CEO has responsibilities like contending with the board of directors and stockholders, and as especially for someone who hasn't been necessarily prepared for that role, that can be a really difficult thing, particularly if you're a creative person. So I'm not convinced that necessarily that's something that he may or may want to do. Who knows? Maybe him being in control will be a really a net positive for the company. But just taking over CEO is it's a very different thing from what Miyamoto was doing already. One of the biggest similarities is for Iwata is actually looking at comparing Nintendo's situation to how Apple dealt with the death of Steve Jobs, because I think that that's a very informative sort of example. For one thing, Jobs, like Iwata, was heavily invested in the company. He founded Apple in the early 90s and then was kicked out of the company and then returned to launch some of their greatest products, starting with the Mac, and has revolutionized all these different industries like telecommunications and music, and obviously had a big imprint on the role that Apple plays at design. All these different places where Jobs was really influential. Also both men had a very similar battle with cancer. Iwata had a growth in his bile duct, and Jobs suffered from pancreatic cancer, and they both underwent treatment for it and then came back to their position, and then later it went into remission. So, and another thing that's really interesting is that they were both really secretive outside of the company about the severity of their disease. Jobs was not very forthcoming about what he was struggling with. And I'm sure for most people, they probably didn't know that Iwata dying wasn't like this thing that was sort of building up to this is something that's getting worse and worse. But it's probably a surprise for most people. I know that was certainly true for myself. It was interesting with Steve Jobs. During that time, he had the foresight to groom someone like Tim Cook to take over the company, and so no one really knows what's going to happen, what Nintendo's succession plan sort of looks like. But I think that like any responsible CEO, if you knew that his prognosis wasn't good, there was a contingency plan in place for the future of the company, and if they wanted to promote someone internally. So, I think the biggest thing for me is Nintendo's a really old company. I think we really forget that. Iwata was only the fourth president over more than 100 different years. He was the first president outside of the Yamauchi family, who obviously had started the company as a playing card company and then ushered it up through the Nintendo video game days as well. So, obviously I'm incredibly saddened by the news. Obviously I'm sure there's a lot of work that still need to be done, a lot of projects that I'm sure he wanted to oversee, and obviously the loss to his family and friends. I can't even imagine what that's like. And but I think one of the things that's going to be hard for us is that we'll be the first generation of people who play games to start to experience the loss of some of our icons because of how young the video game industry is. And Iwata wasn't that old, he was only 55. So this is going to be, I think for me, it's a big reminder of how much history is still, how much history gets lost when when the first generation of game designers, and they pass away. And we're going to have to start experiencing that. And that's a really sobering moment. And it's a really big deal. So anyway, obviously, my heart goes out to his family, and of course to the folks at Nintendo, and to all the fans out there who are very touched by his work. So hopefully this will yield to hopefully better things will come in the future, and it'll be exciting to watch Nintendo as it goes forward. So I'll see you all next week.